So I had this idea kicking around my head for some time now. While I've made a lot of bandsaw boxes in the past, I've never attempted to make one with legs before. I think maybe I was subliminally influenced by a creature common here in Florida. I really regret using a Sharpie marker here. It bled through the wood down several layers and takes a lot of sanding to get those red marks off. I'm too lazy to take off my resaw blade on the bandsaw here, but the curves aren't too sharp, so the thicker blade does lead to less deflection and a smoother cut generally. It does mean you have to nibble at the wood sometimes. The body of this box is a mahogany core with maple on the outsides. The maple has a bit of spalting on it. I wish it had more. It's actually 5 pieces of wood laminated together. My oscillating spindle sander has a max height of 4 inches, and I think this box is closer to 5. I will clean up that edge that I can't quite get with my orbital hand sander later. I gave some thought on how to make the legs of this box follow the curved form at the top. I really want it to almost be lifted off the table like it's walking. If I owned a CNC machine, I imagine I could get a good fit. But perfectly matching an outside curve with an inside curve is beyond my skill level, and I don't have a CNC machine. So there's probably going to be a little bit of epoxy to fill in the gaps. At first I traced the outside curve of the box directly onto the piece of walnut that I was going to use for the legs. I used the actual shape of the box as the template, and then moving the box down by 1/2 inch, I could get a nice arch. What I noticed doing this is that the legs were narrowing towards the bottom of the box, and I really wanted them to be a consistent length throughout. 1/4 inch plywood and tracing the top part using the box as a stencil. Then I cut that portion out on the scroll saw. As you will see later, I used the compass set at a 1/2 inch and ran the needle along the edge of the stencil so the pencil line would be inset the same length throughout the whole form. I've seen this trick also using a washer or maybe just even your thumb, but I like the compass. I'm taking the plywood template and tracing the form onto the walnut I'll be using for the legs. Again, too lazy to take off my resaw blade. I really should have on the curve this sharp. That's why I'm doing those relief cuts there. It helps you make the sharp turns without putting so much friction on the blade. This is a rabbiting bit with interchangeable bearings. The idea is you put on a bigger bearing if you want a shallow cut and a smaller bearing if you want a deeper cut. As you're watching me route the rabbit onto the box, you'll see a little scorch mark forming at the top where the bearing's riding. Turns out I had the bearing on too tight and I was missing a little rubber gasket on the bottom, so the bearing was not spinning independent of the router, and all that friction just caused it to burn right up. It's generally a good practice to take smaller, more shallow cuts and slowly work your way up to the final depth when using a router. Unfortunately, this can sometimes lead to inconsistent results. I'm cleaning that up here with a chisel. I'm attaching the plywood leg template to the rough cut walnut legs using double-sided carpet tape. The idea was to use a flush trim router bit to get the leg to the exact dimensions of the template. I should have thought about this more carefully. The arch contains both end grain and side grain, making it difficult to route without getting a catch. I thought by using a pattern bit where the cutting edge sits proud of the bearing only a little bit, I could avoid any mishaps. but I was very wrong. I ended up destroying one of these legs on a nasty catch. I also should have used a push block to secure it a little bit better. After all my bad luck with the router, I decide to switch to the oscillating spindle sander to get the legs to the dimension I wanted. It's definitely a little bit slower and a little bit less accurate, but a lot safer. I decide that I want to put a pattern on the front and the back of the box. I'm routing a trough right now that I'm going to later fill with epoxy. I start with a small bit and route around the edges, and then I switch to a larger bit to hog out the middle. I'm using blue painter's tape around the edges of the trough that I routed to prevent resin from spilling over the sides. It didn't work as good as I would have hoped. I'm wondering if maybe duct tape or something would have been better, but it might have been hard to peel off in the end. I use CEA glue here to provide a barrier between the wood and my resin. Wood has a lot of moisture in it, and I don't want to sit this in a toaster oven to dry it out. It takes too long. Moisture causes resin to bubble up. This will lead to a clearer cast. I'm using Alumilite resin. The A side and B side of the resin needs to be mixed at equal weights, so I'm using a digital scale. I got a lot of great tips on resin casting from Zach Higgins' channel. I will link it in the comments. The Alumilite dust is in the side A, which is thinner and making it easier to mix and pour. I had my wife act as the color consultant, and she decided that on a violet dust with a darker purple dye. Alumilite resin hardens in about 7 minutes, so you have to move pretty fast. I hit the resin with a torch occasionally. The heat pops the bubbles and makes the resin easier to pour and stir. You see me using a thin stick to stretch out that drop of purple dye I put into the resin. It leads to a cool veining pattern. However, not fully mixing the dye with the resin will come back to bite me later. Alright guys, join me for part 2 where we find out what's in this box.